The dust-covered coupe rolled into the Blackwood Crown Motors showroom, and the laughter started before Mason Reed had even climbed out of the driver's seat. Sterling Blackwood, the chief executive of the dealership, took one look at the peeling gray paint and announced that the car was worth exactly $555, not even enough to cover the price of a single tire on the vehicles behind him. In front of a room full of wealthy guests, he suggested that a single father like Mason should already know his place in a building like this one. Mason said nothing in return. He simply set a sealed envelope on the counter and asked for an independent appraisal, nothing more. 10 minutes later, an appraiser lifted the hood, went pale, and said the only words that mattered: "This car is worth $5 million. If you enjoy watching arrogant people go silent at the worst possible moment, tap subscribe now and stay with this story all the way to the end." The coupe moved down the quiet Connecticut road with a low, steady engine growl that did not match its tired appearance. The gray paint chipped along the fenders, and one headlight dimmed by years of weather and neglect. To anyone glancing from the sidewalk, it looked like a car headed for a scrapyard rather than a showroom, the kind of vehicle people assumed had been kept only because its owner could not afford anything better. Mason Reed drove it the way he did everything else in his life, without pretense, without hurry, and without any interest in what strangers thought of him. He was not a desperate man. He worked as a freelance restoration specialist, careful with his money, and he had raised his daughter Lydia alone since his wife had passed years earlier. He never bragged about his skills, and he never traded on his father's name, even though that name carried more weight than almost anyone in the building he was about to enter could imagine. Everett Reed had spent the better part of his career as an engineer inside the experimental division of the Kingsley Motor Company, a small but ambitious manufacturer that had tried, and ultimately failed, to compete against the larger automakers of its era. According to the official record most collectors relied upon, the company's single prototype coupe had been destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1969, a loss that had turned the vehicle into something of a legend among historians who assumed it no longer existed anywhere in the world. What the official record did not show was that Everett had quietly and legally taken possession of the car before the company folded, along with its complete design archive, its testing journals, and a formal transfer document signed by the company's founder himself. He never spoke about it publicly, never listed it for sale, and never allowed anyone outside the family to examine it closely, choosing instead to seal it away under a layer of protective gray paint that made it look far less remarkable than it truly was. Before he died, Mason's father had given him one instruction about the car sitting under a canvas cover in the garage for nearly 2 decades. Never hand it to the highest bidder. Hand it to someone who understands why it deserves to survive. For years, Mason had honored that request by doing nothing at all, keeping the vehicle hidden and untouched while he focused on raising his daughter and building a quiet, steady life. Recently, a museum had reached out with interest in a partnership, but they needed insurance backing, transportation logistics, and a commercial sponsor willing to stand behind the vehicle's provenance. Around the same time, Blackwood Crown Motors had launched a public advertising campaign promising free appraisals for classic automobiles and claiming that every customer, regardless of background, would be treated with complete fairness. Vivian Harrington, the chairwoman of the company's board, had quietly invited Mason to the dealership to discuss placing the car in a new heritage exhibition space the company was planning. Sterling Blackwood, however, had barely glanced at the meeting file and knew only that some private car owner would be arriving that afternoon. Mason chose not to announce who he was in advance. He wanted to see, without any preferential treatment, how the staff would treat someone who did not look wealthy walking through their doors. Part of him hoped he was wrong to feel wary, that the advertisements promising fairness for every customer meant something real once you actually walked through the door and stood in front of a stranger holding the keys to your family's history. Another part of him, the part shaped by years of watching people size him up, based on his boots and his jacket rather than anything he actually said, suspected he already knew how the afternoon would unfold before it even began. Lydia called him briefly before he left the house, telling her father not to let anyone pressure him into selling the car for less than it deserved. Mason told her he only wanted to find out whether this particular dealership was worthy of his father's legacy at all, and then he pulled out of the driveway toward the glass tower bearing the Blackwood name, where camera crews were already setting up for some kind of event. A security guard at the entrance took one look at the aging coupe and directed Mason toward the scrap intake area behind the building rather than the main showroom doors. Mason held up his appointment letter, but the receptionist barely glanced at it, her eyes fixed instead on his worn work jacket and scuffed boots rather than the name printed on the page. Grant Hollis, the dealership's sales director, appeared moments later and explained, almost cheerfully, that the front showroom was reserved for buyers considering vehicles priced above $250,000. Delivering the line with the practiced ease of someone who had said it to plenty of people before Mason and expected to say it to plenty more after him. He glanced past Mason toward the polished sedans and coupes gleaming under the showroom lights, then back at the dusty coupe idling near the curb, as though the comparison alone should settle the matter without further discussion. Mason had encountered this particular brand of condescension before. In parts warehouses and auction houses and insurance offices, where people decided what he was worth before he had said more than a few words, and he had long ago learned that reacting with anger only confirmed whatever assumption the other person had already made. Mason asked calmly how expensive a car needed to be before it was allowed through the front entrance, and Grant answered that the vehicle Mason had brought probably could not cover the cost of cleaning the floor it would sit on. Sterling was in the middle of filming a promotional segment with several investors and VIP guests when he noticed the small crowd gathering around the unfamiliar coupe near the entrance. Sensing an opportunity to perform his supposed expertise for the cameras, he decided to turn the moment into an impromptu demonstration of what he called rapid valuation skill. He walked over, tapped his knuckles against the hood, and announced that the peeling paint, the outdated interior, and the absence of any visible manufacturer badge made the car nearly worthless in any serious market. He asked Mason, loudly enough for the guests to hear, whether he was hoping to trade the wreck in toward a financed SUV, drawing an easy laugh from several onlookers who seemed grateful for the entertainment in the middle of an otherwise routine afternoon. When Mason mentioned that he was a single father who had raised his daughter alone, Sterling's expression shifted into something resembling sympathy, though it never reached his eyes, and he declared that the dealership could generously help by accepting the vehicle at scrap value, framing the offer as an act of charity rather than what it actually was. A photographer hired for the event instinctively raised her camera toward the exchange, sensing a compelling image without yet understanding how much more compelling the story behind it would eventually become. Sterling, energized by the attention, straightened his jacket and continued, clearly enjoying the sense that he was demonstrating exactly the kind of decisive leadership his investors had come to see that afternoon. Grant ran a cursory check, typed a handful of arbitrary details into the system, and printed out an official-looking valuation slip showing a single number, $555. Sterling read the figure aloud to the gathered guests, and laughter rippled through the showroom floor. He remarked that the amount would not even cover a single wheel on the Bentley parked a few feet away. Mason did not raise his voice or argue the point. He simply asked Sterling 3 direct questions in succession. Was this the dealership's official valuation? Did Sterling personally stand behind the number? And did company policy allow for an independent appraisal upon request? Confident that he was about to humiliate Mason even further, Sterling answered yes to all 3 without a second thought, treating the questions as nothing more than a formality that would let him close out the moment and move on to guests he considered more worthy of his time. He did not notice, or did not care, that several phones in the crowd were already recording, or that Grant had quietly stepped back toward the counter to prepare the paperwork he assumed would be needed within minutes. To Sterling, this was simply another afternoon of demonstrating his own instincts in front of an audience that admired him, and he had no reason yet to suspect that his own words were about to become the very evidence that unraveled him. Grant was not finished. Beyond the printed slip, he produced a folder containing what he described as a routine transfer agreement, sliding it across the counter toward Mason with practiced ease. Buried within its clauses were provisions allowing the dealership to take immediate ownership upon signature, to unilaterally revise the valuation after a technical inspection, to charge storage fees if the seller changed his mind, and to sell or dismantle the vehicle outright if it was not reclaimed within a narrow window of time. Grant covered the relevant section with another stack of papers and simply pointed toward the signature line at the bottom, moving quickly as though speed alone might carry Mason past the details he did not want, examined too closely. Mason had spent enough years reading technical contracts for private collectors to recognize the shape of a trap even when it was buried beneath friendly language and a company letterhead. He noticed the clause granting the dealership authority to revise its own valuation after the fact, the clause allowing storage fees to accumulate against a seller who simply hesitated, and the clause permitting the vehicle to be sold or dismantled entirely if it was not reclaimed within an unreasonably narrow window. None of it was illegal on its face, which was precisely what made it dangerous, since most people who walked through these doors would never think to read that closely before signing. Mason read every word carefully before asking why a supposedly free appraisal required an immediate transfer of ownership before any inspection had even taken place. Sterling's patience thinned quickly, and he remarked that people without money tended to distrust every contract placed in front of them because they simply did not understand how business worked. He offered to raise the figure to $600 if Mason would sign immediately, treating the increase as an act of generosity. One of the VIP guests asked what Sterling intended to do with the car once it belonged to the dealership, and Sterling answered without hesitation that it would either be used as showroom decoration or hauled off to a scrapyard. Mason asked whether the chief executive routinely pressured customers into signing transfer paperwork before any appraisal was performed. The question visibly unsettled Grant, but Sterling continued mocking Mason, eager to appear clever in front of his audience rather than pausing to consider what he had just admitted aloud. A retired attorney among the VIP guests leaned toward the person beside her and murmured that she had heard enough to make her uneasy about signing anything with this dealership herself, though she kept the observation to a whisper rather than interrupting the spectacle unfolding in front of her. Mason noticed the exchange but said nothing, filing it away the same way he filed away every other small detail that afternoon, quietly certain that patience would eventually accomplish more than confrontation ever could. Oscar Bennett, the dealership's head of technical operations, happened to be walking past the showroom floor and noticed something about the door structure, the aluminum framing beneath the chipped paint, and the placement of the exhaust outlet that did not match anything he recognized from typical production models. He crouched beside the car and examined a weld seam near the rear quarter panel, recognizing a technique consistent with experimental fabrication methods from the 1960s. In a quiet voice, he suggested to Sterling that the valuation should wait until the chassis number had been properly checked. Sterling snapped at him to return to the service bay and stop interrupting the event in front of paying guests. Before walking away, Oscar looked at Mason and said that some cars look old because they have been forgotten, and some cars look old because history simply has not caught up with them yet. He had spent 30 years working with his hands on vehicles most people never bothered to look at twice, and in that time he had learned to trust the small details everyone else rushed past: the spacing of rivets, the angle of a weld, the particular way a hood seam settled when a chassis had been built by hand rather than stamped out on an assembly line. Nothing about this car matched the mass-produced vehicles he serviced every day, and the more he studied it out of the corner of his eye while pretending to walk away, the more certain he became that Sterling had just laughed his way past something the entire industry would eventually want to know about. Mason placed the sealed envelope he had been carrying onto the counter and calmly requested that someone contact Dr. Evelyn Shaw, explaining that her name appeared in the paperwork tied to the vehicle's history. Grant hesitated, but the mention of her name caught the attention of a nearby staff member who recognized it immediately from insurance and museum circles. Sterling, still riding the confidence of his earlier performance, agreed to the request mainly to prove to his audience that the outcome would not change. Within minutes, a call was placed, and word spread quietly through the building that an outside expert was on her way to examine the very car Sterling had just dismissed in front of dozens of witnesses. Grant used the delay to quietly ask one of the junior staff members to pull up Evelyn Shaw's professional credentials, and what he found on the screen made him noticeably less comfortable than he had been only minutes earlier. Her name appeared in insurance filings, museum authentication records, and legal disputes spanning more than a decade, none of which suggested she was the type of expert who would simply confirm whatever number the dealership had already printed. The mood in the showroom shifted slightly, the earlier laughter replaced by a quieter, more uncertain energy, though Sterling remained entirely unaware of what was coming. Evelyn Shaw arrived within the hour, having been in the area for an unrelated meeting with Vivian Harrington regarding the dealership's new heritage division. Sterling greeted her with unshaken confidence, telling her this was simply a formality to prove that Mason had wasted everyone's time on a worthless vehicle. Evelyn said nothing in response. She circled the coupe slowly, studying the proportions of the body panels, the shape of the air intakes, the positioning of the front axle, and the angle of the windshield frame. Within less than a minute, her posture and expression changed entirely, and the casual confidence she had walked in with disappeared completely. She requested, in a firm and businesslike tone, that no one touch the vehicle, that the automatic lift system be powered down immediately, that the enclosed inspection bay be opened, and that a metal scanning light and an alloy testing device be brought to her without delay. Sterling tried once more to inject a note of humor into the moment, suggesting that Evelyn was being overly dramatic about what was obviously an unremarkable trade-in, but she did not so much as glance in his direction as she pulled on a pair of thin cotton gloves and continued her examination. Grant hovered nearby, uncertain now whether to keep siding with his employer's earlier confidence or to quietly distance himself from a valuation he had personally typed into the system without checking a single detail. Evelyn examined the frame section behind the driver's seat and located a hidden marking stamped into the metal reading KX001. Oscar was called back to assist, and he carefully removed a small protective panel beneath the dashboard, revealing a ceramic identification plate bearing the logo of the Kingsley Motor Company underneath. Evelyn continued her inspection and confirmed a series of remarkable details. an experimental engine that had never entered mass production, hand-finished welds matching archival photographs from 1967, surface texture that had initially appeared to be rust, but was in fact a removable protective coating, and an original body shell still largely intact beneath the dull gray paint layered over top of it. The laughter that had filled the showroom earlier was completely gone by this point. Sterling began to ask, with noticeably less certainty, whether the vehicle could simply be an elaborate replica rather than an authentic piece of automotive history, his voice carrying none of the confidence it had held only 20 minutes earlier when he was mocking the same car in front of his guests. Evelyn reminded him, without looking up from her work, that replicas did not typically arrive with original manufacturer transfer paperwork, hand-signed testing journals, and a chassis stamping sequence reserved exclusively for a single experimental production run. A few of the investors who had been considering the earlier trade-in joke as harmless entertainment now exchanged uneasy glances, quietly recalculating what they had just witnessed a member of the dealership's leadership say out loud. Mason opened the sealed envelope he had brought and produced the original transfer documents from the Kingsley Motor Company, a technical testing journal, and a black-and-white photograph showing his father Everett standing proudly beside the very car now sitting in the showroom. Evelyn compared the signatures, the chassis number, and the insurance documentation against her own knowledge of the company's history, then placed a brief call to a museum contact and two private collectors who had spent years searching for a vehicle believed to have been destroyed decades earlier. She cross-referenced the chassis, stamping against a set of archival photographs stored on her tablet, matched the shape of the taillight housings to a discontinued production drawing, and confirmed that the ceramic identification plate carried a serial sequence reserved exclusively for prototype vehicles built inside the Kingsley Experimental Division. She explained, mostly to herself, that a car this significant would ordinarily require weeks of laboratory analysis before any figure could be published with confidence, but that the combination of physical evidence and Mason's original paperwork left almost no room for reasonable doubt. After completing her preliminary verification, Evelyn stood in front of Sterling and the assembled guests and delivered her conclusion in a clear, unwavering voice. The minimum insurance valuation for this Kingsley Aerodyne X1 was $5 million. No one in the showroom spoke for several seconds. Sterling stared down at the valuation slip, still sitting on the counter, the number $555 printed plainly across it in his own company's letterhead. Mason repeated, without any trace of triumph in his voice, that Sterling had personally confirmed this number reflected the true value of the vehicle only a short while earlier. Sterling's expression shifted rapidly from disbelief to something closer to panic as he realized how many witnesses and how many recording devices had captured the entire exchange, including the moment he had personally signed his name beneath a valuation of $555. He scanned the room quickly, looking for an ally who might help him reframe what had just happened, but found only guests exchanging quiet glances and staff members suddenly very interested in paperwork on the counter in front of them. Within moments he attempted to reverse course entirely, turning to face the crowd and offering Mason $1,500,000 in cash on the spot, calling it a life-changing opportunity for a hard-working single father. Sterling told the gathered guests that the entire exchange had merely been an elaborate test designed by the dealership to demonstrate its own expertise in uncovering hidden automotive treasures. He insisted that Blackwood Crown Motors deserved credit for helping Mason discover the true value of his own property. Mason asked, evenly, why a test of this nature would require a transfer of ownership document attached to a valuation of $555. Sterling avoided the question entirely. and instead raised his offer to $2 million in an attempt to move the conversation forward before anyone could dwell too long on the contract sitting untouched on the counter. He framed the offer as an act of extraordinary generosity toward a man he had mocked publicly only minutes before. The offers kept climbing as Sterling grew visibly desperate to close the situation before it spiraled further out of his control. $2 million became $2.5 million with a new sport utility vehicle included, and that figure eventually became $3 million if Mason would agree to sign before the end of the day. Mason declined every single offer without hesitation or negotiation. He explained that the car had never been brought to this dealership to be sold to whoever offered the largest number. It had been brought here to determine who, if anyone, was worthy of representing the Kingsley legacy going forward. Sterling forced a laugh and accused Mason of artificially driving up the price through theatrics, insisting that no reasonable seller simply walked away from $3 million in cash unless the entire scene had been staged from the very beginning. Mason reminded him, evenly, that Sterling was the one who had brought cameras, guests, and a printed valuation slip into what was supposed to be a routine appraisal, and that nothing about the last hour had been arranged by anyone sitting on his side of the counter. Mason answered him directly, telling him that he had looked at a man wearing an old jacket and decided he had the right to take everything from him for $555, and that no amount of money afterward could undo that decision. A few of the VIP guests who had laughed loudest at the original valuation now stood quietly near the edges of the room, no longer certain whether they wanted to be associated with what they were watching unfold. One of them, a woman who had arrived that afternoon considering a six-figure purchase of her own, quietly asked an assistant whether the dealership treated every unfamiliar customer this way when the cameras were not specifically pointed at them. Humiliated in front of his own guests, Sterling grew increasingly agitated and invoked an obscure inspection fee clause, declaring that the vehicle could not leave the property until Mason paid an outstanding service charge. Grant hurried to place a physical barrier in front of the car's path, following his employer's instructions without question. Sterling went further, threatening to invoke a property lien if Mason attempted to remove the vehicle from the premises by force. Evelyn immediately reminded him that Mason had not signed any transfer document whatsoever, and Oscar confirmed that no billable service had actually been performed on the vehicle at any point that day. Sterling ignored both of them and ordered his security staff to seal off the exhibition area entirely, his voice rising for the first time that afternoon as the calm authority he had projected earlier began to slip away from him in front of the same crowd he had been performing for only an hour before. One of the security guards hesitated, glancing between Sterling and Evelyn as though unsure whose instructions actually carried weight anymore, before slowly moving to comply with the order regardless. Mason showed no sign of panic. He simply checked his watch and told Sterling, calmly, that he had roughly 3 minutes remaining before the real meeting of the day was set to begin. Right on cue, the elevator doors at the far end of the showroom opened, and Vivian Harrington stepped out, accompanied by Naomi Pierce, an attorney representing the company's board of directors. Vivian immediately asked why the Kingsley Aerodyne was surrounded by security personnel rather than being treated with the care it deserved. Sterling attempted to explain that Mason was simply a disruptive seller causing trouble on the showroom floor. Vivian corrected him at once, informing the room that Mason Reed was not a walk-in customer at all, but the lawful heir of Everett Reed and the rightful custodian of the Kingsley Aerodyne X1, the complete Kingsley Engineering Archive, the original development journals, the licensing rights to the Kingsley name itself, and more than 4,000 previously unreleased historical documents. It was Vivian herself who had arranged for Mason's visit that day, in order to discuss a 10-year partnership agreement. Harrington Capital, Vivian explained, was considering a $120 million investment into a new division to be called Blackwood Heritage Auctions, and the Kingsley Aerodyne had been intended as the centerpiece of its public launch. Mason's archive of documents would allow the company to authenticate dozens of other surviving Kingsley vehicles scattered around the world, an asset far more valuable than any single car on its own. Without Mason's signature, the entire division would be legally barred from using the Kingsley name or displaying the vehicle in any promotional capacity whatsoever. Sterling, it turned out, had never bothered to read the meeting file closely enough to realize the significance of the man standing in front of him, dismissing him instead because of his last name and his worn clothing. Vivian turned to Grant and asked for the dealership's official valuation of the vehicle. Reluctantly, Grant produced the slip reading $555, bearing Sterling's own signature at the bottom. The board members present looked first at the number, then at the car now confirmed to be worth $5 million, and said nothing at all. One board member finally broke the silence, asking Sterling directly how a company preparing to launch a heritage auction division worth $120 million had allowed a member of its own leadership to publicly humiliate the very man whose signature the entire project depended upon. Sterling had no answer prepared, and for the first time that afternoon, his usual confidence failed to fill the silence the way it always had before. Naomi Pierce reviewed the transfer agreement. Grant had attempted to have Mason sign earlier that afternoon and quickly identified the buried clause disguised under a heading labeled Inspection Authorization. Had Mason signed it, the dealership could have later claimed legal ownership of the vehicle for a mere $555, regardless of its true worth. Sterling immediately tried to shift blame onto Grant, insisting the entire scheme had been Grant's idea alone. Grant refused to accept the accusation quietly, stating in front of the board that Sterling himself had instructed staff to lock in bargain deals before customers ever learned the real value of what they were bringing in. Mason then revealed that the dealership's own security cameras had recorded the entire exchange from start to finish. Sterling had once boasted publicly that every appraisal at his dealership was recorded to protect the company's reputation, and that same policy now stood as clear evidence against him in front of the very board he answered to. Vivian turned to Mason and asked plainly whether the proposed $120 million partnership still had any chance of moving forward. Many in the room assumed Mason would demand an enormous financial settlement after everything that had happened to him that afternoon. Instead, he made it clear that the issue was never really about $555 or even $5 million core dollars. If he had not carried the proper documents and the knowledge to defend himself, Sterling might genuinely have walked away with his family's most important possession for almost nothing. Mason pointed out that other people who had walked through these same doors in the past might not have had the ability to protect themselves the way he had. He laid out 3 conditions before any further negotiation would continue: a full 5-year audit of the dealership's used vehicle appraisal practices, restitution for any customers who had been knowingly underpaid, and a new policy requiring independent appraisal on every classic vehicle before any transfer of ownership could occur. Sterling refused to apologize for any part of what had happened. He accused Mason of exploiting a minor clerical error in order to seize control of a company he had no real claim to. He turned his frustration toward Vivian as well, accusing the board of betraying the Blackwood family name over what he called a mechanic in an old jacket, his voice loud enough now to carry across the entire showroom floor and draw the attention of guests who had begun drifting quietly toward the exits only moments earlier. Vivian did not raise her own voice to match his. She simply waited until he finished speaking, letting the silence that followed make her point far more effectively than any argument could have, before responding calmly and informing him that the Blackwood family currently held only 18% of total company shares. Harrington Capital, along with several institutional shareholders, controlled more than enough voting power to suspend him immediately if his behavior continued to threaten the future of the Heritage Partnership. Sterling lunged for the contract sitting on the table, but Naomi calmly moved it out of his reach before he could touch it. There was no physical altercation of any kind. Sterling's downfall unfolded entirely through his own recorded words and the arrogance he had displayed in front of dozens of witnesses that afternoon. Vivian convened an emergency video session with the remaining board members right there on the showroom floor, presenting the accumulated evidence one piece at a time. The $555 valuation slip, the buried ownership transfer clause, the improper attempt to detain Mason's vehicle, footage of Sterling mocking a customer in front of paying guests, and corroborating statements from both Grant and Oscar. The board voted to suspend Sterling from his position as chief executive pending a full internal investigation into his conduct. His executive access credentials were deactivated on the spot. The same security guard who had once directed Mason toward the scrap intake entrance now opened the front doors for him without hesitation, while Sterling stood by, stripped of the authority to give any further orders. Mason did not mock Sterling or gloat over his sudden fall from power. He simply told him that Sterling had looked at his jacket and decided what he was worth, and the board had simply looked at his actions and reached the very same conclusion about him. Vivian extended a pen toward Mason, ready for him to formalize the new partnership agreement, but he did not sign it immediately. Instead, he insisted on restructuring several key elements of the proposal before agreeing to move forward with the company at all. He requested that the new auction division be renamed the Reed Kingsley Heritage Center, rather than carrying the Blackwood name at its center. Oscar Bennett was appointed as the division's new head of technical operations, since he had been the only person in the entire building willing to question the valuation before the paperwork was ever unsealed. Evelyn Shaw was placed in charge of an independent appraisal board with full authority over future authentication decisions. Mason himself accepted a role as Heritage Advisor, a position that allowed him to guide major decisions without taking on daily operational responsibilities he had never wanted in the first place. The internal audit that followed uncovered a disturbing pattern stretching back several years. A number of older customers and working-class sellers had been quietly undervalued and pressured into signing transfer paperwork before they ever learned what their vehicles were genuinely worth. Grant eventually admitted that this practice had been actively encouraged by Sterling as a standard part of dealership strategy. Grant was terminated from his position and now faces a separate civil investigation into his role in the scheme. The company established a restitution fund to repurchase vehicles or compensate affected sellers for the difference between what they were originally paid and what their property had actually been worth. Mason specifically asked that his own name be kept out of promotional materials celebrating the changes, insisting that the outcome mattered far more than any personal recognitions attached to it. Several of the affected sellers were contacted individually rather than through a public statement, since Mason felt strongly that people who had already been humiliated once by this dealership deserved a private resolution rather than another spectacle built around their misfortune. Naomi Pierce oversaw the restitution process personally, cross-checking each disputed transaction against the recovered appraisal records and ensuring that no family walked away with less than what an honest evaluation would have offered them in the first place. Oscar, now responsible for technical standards across the newly restructured division, insisted that every appraisal moving forward be conducted with at least 2 qualified inspectors present, a policy directly inspired by watching how easily a single dishonest evaluation had nearly cost the Reed family everything. He often told newer staff members the same thing he had told Mason that first afternoon, that a car does not announce its own history out loud, and that the people responsible for judging its worth owe it the patience to look closely before deciding what it deserves. Mason chose not to sell the Kingsley Aerodyne, even after the valuation became public knowledge across collector circles. Instead, he signed a long-term loan agreement allowing the Heritage Center to display the vehicle while ownership remained firmly with the Reed family. Oscar and his technical team carefully stripped away the protective gray coating layer by layer, revealing the deep original blue finish hidden beneath decades of concealment. They resisted the temptation to overstore the vehicle, preserving certain historical wear marks that told their own part of the story. The official insurance valuation remained fixed at $5 million, though at least one private collector quietly offered significantly more through an intermediary, framing the sum as an amount no reasonable person could possibly refuse. Mason turned the offer down without a moment of hesitation, the same way he had turned down every escalating figure Sterling had thrown at him inside the showroom months earlier. He explained simply that the car itself could be priced in dollars, but what his father had left behind inside it could not. 6 months later, the Reed Kingsley Heritage Center opened its doors inside the very same building that had once humiliated Mason in front of a room full of strangers. The Blackwood Crown Motors signage above the entrance had long since been replaced. The Kingsley Aerodyne X1 now sat at the center of the main hall beneath carefully designed lighting, drawing visitors from across the region. Beside the vehicle, there was no mention of Sterling, no printed sale price, only a single engraved plaque that read, "Preserved by Everett Reed, protected by Mason Reed." Lydia made a brief appearance at the opening ceremony, standing quietly near the edge of the crowd as she took in the sight of her grandfather's name displayed for the world to see. She had grown up hearing fragments of the story, a canvas-covered shape in the back of the garage her father never let anyone touch, but she had never fully understood why it mattered so much until she stood in front of the finished exhibit herself. Seeing it finally explained, in a way words never quite had, why her father had refused every offer to sell the car over the years. Mason handed her a copied edition of Everett's earliest design journal, not the original, and told her that one day the decision of who would care for the car next would fall to her alone. The moment between them was brief and understated, never overshadowing the larger story unfolding around them, but it carried a quiet weight all its own. Sterling never returned to his position as chief executive and was eventually forced to sell off a significant portion of his shares to cover the mounting cost of the civil claims filed against him, the very same 18% stake his family had once treated as an unshakable source of authority inside the company that carried their name. Meanwhile, the transparent appraisal process Mason had insisted upon became the new standard practice across every location the company operated. At the opening event, a young employee asked Mason whether he ever regretted turning down $5 million in cash when it had first been offered to him. Mason looked toward the car for a long moment before answering that $5 million was only ever the price of the vehicle itself, and that what his father had truly left behind was never something that could be bought or sold. The story closed with a simple detail displayed inside a glass case near the entrance. The original $555 valuation slip resting beside the official $5 million insurance certificate, with a small printed line beneath them both explaining that one number showed how they had once looked at the car, and the other showed exactly how wrong they had been.
I go straight, right? I mean, there's no other way. Go down this way, right? Yeah. I just... Yeah, I did the frog boss. First try. Killed it. Go left. Trying to get this XP. Hopefully there's another heal up here. See those two big rocks? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Trench. Love you, bro. I appreciate that.
This humble one's name is Guangmo. Should my demise come by your hands, please pass this message to my master. Searching for deity, mortals do aspire. Crave